Man, history is one of those things that sounds straightforward when you're a kid. You read it in school, you memorize dates, you write essays, but the older you get, the more you realize history is not this clean, objective, neutral record of facts. It's stories, it's memories, and memories are messy, they're selective, they're biased, and they're often shaped by whoever's in power. And that brings us to this big question that I think is fascinating and honestly a little unsettling when we talk about Islamic history, especially in the West. Are we really learning about Islam and Muslims from their own voices, or are we learning a version of that history that's been written, edited, and framed by Western narratives? Because here's the thing, when you look at Western education, the Islamic world is kind of treated like this guest appearance in the story of world history. You get Rome, you get Greece, you get medieval Europe, you get the Renaissance, you get the Enlightenment, and somewhere in between there's like this chapter, oh yeah, by the way, there was this Islamic golden age. They did some math and science, then Europe took over again. That's literally how it's framed, like the Islamic world was just this placeholder until Europe woke up again. That framing alone tells you something. It's not a neutral presentation, it's a narrative. But if you actually dive into the sources from the Islamic world itself, it's a whole different vibe. You see civilizations rising and falling. You see debates in philosophy and theology that are just as rich as anything happening in Greece or Europe. You see scientific advancements, hospitals, universities, massive libraries, trade networks stretching across continent. You also see the struggles, the wars, the political corruption, the internal fights, because they wrote about that too. So the question becomes, why don't we hear that version more often? Why is the dominant narrative still the one shaped in Western universities by Western historians, many of whom were working during times when Europe was literally colonizing the Muslim world? Think about it. If you're a European historian in the 1800s studying the history of Islam, you're not doing that in some vacuum. You're doing it while your country is probably colonizing Muslim land. The French in North Africa, the British in India and Egypt, the Dutch in Indonesia. You can't separate the scholarship from the politics. So when they wrote about Islam, even if they were brilliant scholars, they were also serving a certain worldview, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. And the result is that a lot of what we call Islamic history in the West is actually Islamic history as described by Western observers. That's a big difference. Let's take the Crusades as an example, because that's one of those moments where the clash of narratives is super obvious. If you read a Western medieval account of the Crusades, it's framed as this noble mission, knights traveling to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims, fighting for Christendom, all that stuff. It's this romanticized idea of holy war. But if you flip it and read an Islamic historian from that time like Ibn al-Athir, the story changes completely. From that perspective, the Crusaders were invaders. Brutal, savage, massacring civilians. Jerusalem wasn't some foreign land to Muslims. It had been part of their world for centuries. So, to them, the Crusades weren't some noble adventure. They were foreign invasions that caused chaos and destruction. Same events, but the story you tell depends on who's holding the pen. And for the last several centuries, the dominant pen has been in Western hands. Now, I'm not saying you should blindly trust one side over the other. The point is that history is contested, it's layered, and if you're only hearing it from one perspective, you're not getting the full picture. Here's another example that blew my mind. We talk about the European Dark Ages after the fall of Rome. That phrase itself, Dark Ages, already frames it as this period of ignorance and stagnation in Europe. But what people rarely mention is that during that same time, the Islamic world was experiencing this explosion of knowledge. Baghdad had the House of Wisdom, where scholars were translating texts from Greek, Sanskrit, Persian, and developing new ideas on top of that. Medicine, astronomy, algebra, all of that was flourishing. So here's the kicker. When Europe started its Renaissance, guess where a lot of that knowledge came from? It was preserved, studied, and expanded upon by Muslim scholars, and then it got transmitted back into Europe through Spain, Sicily, and the Crusades. But if you only hear the Western version, it sounds like Europe just spontaneously woke up one day and rediscovered wisdom all on its own. The Islamic contribution gets reduced to like a footnote. They kept some Greek books, safe for us. Man, that's such a lazy simplification. And when you realize that, you start to ask, what else has been oversimplified, reframed, or straight up distorted? Like take Ibn Khaldun. This guy is one of the greatest historians and thinkers of all time. He basically invented sociology before sociology was even a thing. He wrote about how civilizations rise and fall, how power shifts, how economics and politics are connected. Modern historians still quote him, but outside of specialized circles, how many people in the West even know his name? Barely anyone. If he had been European, he'd be mentioned alongside Plato and Machiavelli in every classroom, but because he was Muslim from North Africa, he gets sidelined. That's the kind of thing I mean when I say who wrote Islamic history. Because if you're only reading it through the Western lens, you miss the giants like Ibn Khaldun. You miss the nuance. You miss the self-criticism that Muslim historians actually had. Because it wasn't just glorification, they wrote about corruption, decline, hypocrisy. They weren't blind to their flaws. And here's where it gets even more interesting when Western Orientalists came along. These are the scholars who studied the Orient, meaning the Middle East, Asia, Islam. They did incredible work in terms of language and manuscript, but they also tended to frame Muslims as exotic, irrational, sometimes dangerous. Edward Said talks about this in his famous book Orientalism. He shows how the West created this image of the East as the other, something to study, control, dominate. So when we read about Islamic history in Western universities, a lot of that framing is still there. The Islamic world is this strange, distant civilization, not part of our story but this parallel one that occasionally bumps into Europe. And the crazy thing is Muslims themselves don't see their history that way. For them it's the central story, the lived experience, the thing that shaped their identity. So the gap between those two narratives is massive, and bridging that gap is the challenge. Because if you only listen to one, you're basically looking at the world through a one-eyed lens.
Here's the thing, man. When you start looking at history, not just as what happened, but as who told the story of what happened, it completely changes the game. Because history isn't just about the past. It shapes how people see themselves right now. It shapes identity, politics, culture, even how entire nations interact with each other. And with Islamic history, the stakes are even higher, because the way it's been written in the West has had real-world consequences. We're talking about centuries of misunderstanding, prejudice, stereotypes, all rooted in a particular narrative. Let's break this down. When Europe began colonizing Muslim lands in the 18th and 19th centuries, they didn't just bring soldiers and guns. They brought narratives. They needed to justify their domination. And one of the ways they did that was by framing Muslims as backward, irrational, stuck in the past. That narrative made colonization sound like it was some kind of civilizing mission. Like, we're not just conquering them, we're helping them. That's the propaganda. But here's the crazy part. Those narratives didn't vanish when colonialism ended. They got baked into the way Islamic history is taught and remembered in the West. So when a Western student reads about Islam, they're often reading a version of history that was filtered through colonial eyes. Think about how often Islam gets associated with violence in Western storytelling. You hear about jihads, invasions, terrorism, but you rarely hear about the centuries of coexistence, trade, cultural exchange, philosophy. Why? Because the narrative was shaped in a way that emphasized conflict. Conflict made Muslims look dangerous, and if they're dangerous, then controlling them or invading them sounds more justifiable. Now flip that. Imagine if Muslims had written the dominant narrative of Europe. What would they emphasize? Probably the endless wars between European kingdoms, the Crusades, the Inquisitions, the colonization of the Americas, the two world wars. They could easily spin Europe as this continent that was obsessed with bloodshed and domination. But because Europe wrote its own history, it emphasized progress, enlightenment, science, and democracy. See how powerful the storyteller's role is. And here's something people don't talk about enough. Muslims did write their own histories. They had chronicles, biographies, entire traditions of historiography. But because the West dominated the global narrative for the last few centuries, those voices got sidelined, sometimes intentionally, sometimes just because they weren't translated or widely distributed. Take al-Tabari, one of the most important historians in early Islamic history. This guy wrote volumes, literal volumes of history. He's like a one-man Wikipedia of the Islamic world. Yet, how many Westerners have even heard of him? Very few, but they'll know about Herodotus or Tacitus, the classical European historians. Why? Because Western academia decided those were the foundational voices. And here's the kicker. Even when Islamic historians are studied in the West, they're often interpreted through Western categories. Their ideas are reframed, simplified, sometimes even mistranslated, to fit into a European intellectual framework, which means you're still not really hearing their voices. You're hearing an edited version. So when I ask who wrote Islamic history, what I really mean is whose lens are we looking through? Are we hearing Ibn Khaldun in his own words? Or are we hearing a Western professor's interpretation of Ibn Khaldun? Those are two different things. This matters because history shapes identity. If Muslims grow up reading Western-framed versions of their own past, they might internalize some of those narratives. They might start believing that their civilization peaked in the Middle Ages and has been declining ever since. They might buy into the idea that Europe was always more advanced. But if they read their own sources, their own voices, the picture is much more complex. There were ups and downs, yes, but it's not this linear story of golden age, then decline. It's cycles, it's transformations, it's adaptations. And for Western audiences, this matters too. Because if all you ever learn about Islam is through a negative or limited frame, you're going to carry that bias into the present. You're going to see Muslims today through the lens of backward or violent. Because that's the story you've been told for centuries. That's not just bad history, that's dangerous. Now let's talk about the present for a second. Because this whole issue of who writes history is not just some academic debate, it's alive and well today. Look at the media. Look at Hollywood. How often do you see Muslims portrayed as heroes, philosophers, scientists, just regular human beings, versus how often they're shown as villains, extremists, terrorists? It's the same storytelling dynamic, just modernized. And you've got to wonder, in 500 years, when people look back on our time, whose version of history are they going to read? Will they read Muslim voices describing the wars, the politics, the struggles of the 21st century? Or will they mostly read Western accounts? If the pattern holds, it might be the latter, unless something changes. This is why, for me, the conversation about Islamic history versus Western narratives is not just about the past. It's about reclaiming voice. It's about recognizing that the pen is as powerful as the sword, maybe even more powerful, because armies win battles, but writers win memory, and memory shapes the future. So here's what I think people should do. Don't just accept history at face value. Whenever you read about Islam, or about any civilization, really ask yourself, who wrote this? When did they write it? Why did they write it? What was their agenda? If you start asking those questions, history becomes a lot more interesting. It stops being this static list of dates and names, and it becomes a living conversation across centuries. You see the debates, the disagreements, the perspectives, and you realize that truth is often somewhere in between the narratives. Because here's the truth. No civilization is perfect. The Islamic world had its achievements, and it had its dark chapters. The West had its achievements, and it had its dark chapters. But when only one side is allowed to write the story, the balance gets lost. And restoring that balance, that's the real challenge of our time. So who wrote Islamic history? In the West, for the most part, it wasn't Muslims. It was outsiders, often with biases. But that doesn't mean the Muslim voices are lost. They're there. They've been there all along. The question is whether we're willing to listen to them, study them, and take them seriously. And if we do, maybe we'll realize that the clash between Islam and the West isn't some inevitable thing. Maybe it's just a story we've been told, a narrative that's been repeated so often that people think it's reality. But once you see the mechanics of how history is written, you realize narratives can change, stories can be retold, and the future doesn't have to repeat the past.